This is Guy Battle, Chief Executive, Social Value Portal. Thanks for attending. We're just going to wait for 1 more minute for those late stragglers who are just making their tea, and then we're going to get going at 1 minute past 2. Thank you. Okay, everybody, welcome to the webinar, the National TOMS COVID webinar. Pleasure to have you join us today. I thought that my name is Guy Battle, and I'm going to go through as your compere today. Tom, can you push on the next slide, please? So this is what we're going to cover today. After I've introduced you to your speakers, so they're not disembodied voices, we're going to tell you a little bit about how you ask questions and how we're going to answer. I'm going to do a little bit about Social Value Portal and the National TOMS for those who don't know us and those who don't know much about the TOMS, but that'll be ever so quick. And then I'm going to just talk about the context about why we felt a COVID-19 response was needed. And then I'm going to pass on to Agnese Mizia, our Head of Research, who's going to talk us through the substance of the COVID-19 TOMS, and there'll be some detail there as well. And then pass on to Terry Brewer, who is Head of Public Sector, who's specifically going to talk about how council should respond with respect to existing and new tenders. So that's basically the format. Next slide, please, Tom. So these are your panelists. We've got myself, Guy Battle, I'm Chief Exec, Social Value Portal. Then we'll have Agnese Mizia, who's Head of Research and Innovation, Terry Brewer, who's our Public Sector Lead, and Nathan Good, who's Head of Strategy, who will join us with the panel discussion that we'll have right at the end of this. Next slide, please, Tom. Tom, do you want to explain this?
Good afternoon, everybody. So as you can probably see in your control panel, you have an audio tab to sort out your audio settings on your mic and headphones. But more importantly, you should have a questions tab. Now, we will be reserving time towards the end of the session for a Q&A. Unfortunately, due to technical limitations, we can't have spoken questions presented over to the panelists. So we'll be using text only. Now you will be able to enter questions throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions related to the TOMS or anything our panelists are saying, please just enter it in that tab there. We will also have various polls throughout the webinar. At certain points during the presentation, they will be appearing on screen, and you will have 15 seconds to vote for them, and then we will take them down and share the results immediately afterwards. So I'm going to pass back over to Guy now, who will explain the rest of the structure of the web.
Yeah, so if you just do the next slide, and then we're going to run into the first poll, I think, just to test everything out. So next slide, Tom. That's great. Polls, we've explained. So this is the first poll. So Tom is going to bring the poll up. We'll have 15 seconds to answer, and then we'll share the answers with you. So what sector are you from, poll? You should all just be able to touch the screen, touch the dot. Excellent. Show the result, Tom. Very good. So it's all working. Excellent. So we've got actually a good mixture by the looks of things. Do you want to do the next poll, Tom? That's great. So has your organisation furloughed any colleagues? Bring the poll up, Tom.
Measure that might create the undue perception that the measure was designed to punish organizations, whilst this is clearly not the case. So I recommend that you also look at this new column, which is column E in the definition and guidance tab, and read through the suggested application for the measures whenever that's been provided. So we can move on to the next slide, Tom. And for once, I don't want to start from the top, but I want to start from the core, or from the heart of this, which is really supporting resilient communities and supporting communities to become healthier and safer for everyone. So the outcome that we have within this theme is supporting communities to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. And while we have 4 measures, and the first measure is inviting organizations to look at their response from a strategic perspective and think about how they can best contribute to tackling the crisis, both through their intervention and their supply chain. The core of this for me is really measure 15 and 16. And measure 15 is allowing employees to volunteer within their communities. And we see that with this crisis and the changes that is brought to all of our lives, organizations are now connected to different communities. And because a lot of people are working remotely or might be, again, on furlough, organizations are not just connected to the location where the contract's been delivered, but through their staff, they're connected to the community of residents of their staff. And so by allowing their staff to safely volunteer within their community, they can support these local networks to help the most vulnerable groups or people self-isolating or essential workers. And measure 16 instead really looks at the locality of the contract more directly, and how organizations can support local authorities, VCSEs, but also all those organizations that are on the front line of the response, and also thinking about the most vulnerable groups, at-risk categories, as well as essential workforce within the locality of the contract. So if we can move to the next slide, Tom, and the next theme, we're now looking at the growth theme. And within the outcome of supporting workers, SMEs, and VCSEs to face the crisis, we have quite a range of measures. The first 2 measures, measures 5 and 6, are really about supporting SMEs and VCSEs. And this is in recognition that SMEs will be hit more harshly by the crisis, both because they might have less cash availability or facing harsher liquidity constraints, but also because additionally VCSEs and some of the local VCSEs might be on the front line of the response. So measure 5, it's about providing expert support, for example, to ensure business continuity for SMEs and VCSEs. And measure 6 is all around prompt payment to make sure that we help these organizations as much as possible through these financially challenging times. If we then look at measures 7 through 12, all of those are about supporting workers. And workers are both direct employees, and specifically for measure 12, they are supply chain and workers as well. And workers are supported around their mental health and well-being, clearly with a specific focus on mental health during these times with measures 7 and 8. They are supported through these initiatives to operate and work within virtual spaces that are safe, and looking at measure 9 and 10, because we know that so much of our working activity has now been moved to these virtual spaces, and this clearly poses a whole other set of questions around whether these spaces are not only fit to ensure good working relationships, but also safe from a virtual point of view. And then measure 11 is specifically around supporting staff and essential workers, which would be through different types of intervention, but also financially, as it has come up recently in the news. While measure 12, it's explicitly aimed both at own staff and supply chain staff, and it's around interventions that could go a bit further and reduce the economic impact of the crisis for the most vulnerable categories. Finally, measure 13 looks at the whole supply chain and can be used to sort of make sure that all the COVID measures, they trickle through and they ripple through the supply chain, and contractors are engaged to deliver them as well. So if we can move to the next slide, Tom. We're finally looking at the last two themes, which are the jobs and skills theme and the environmental theme. And I want to start from the bottom, which is the measure around the environmental theme. And we all know that the attention has somewhat moved away from environmental issues, which is something that we're clearly trying to manage with our provisions for the existing environmental measures, but we also wanted to have a specific measures in the COVID-19 plugin, which is really about any initiatives that organizations are in a position to provide for the appropriate collection of single-use disposable masks or gloves, just to remember that we need to be mindful of our environmental impact and to prevent that we have to pay that cost further down the line. So moving forward to the jobs and skills theme, these measures are slightly different from the others. And this is because the outcome is all about retaining jobs and skills during the crisis. So clearly, these measures are not specifically designed for procurement, but more for measurement and management. And they allow organizations to transparently report what decisions they're making regarding the staff on contract, but also to inform procuring organizations on how they're making these decisions. So very simply, the first three measures are focused on own staff, while the fourth one is for supply chain. And the first three measures allow to provide a breakdown of staff that for measure 1 is being retained on contract with the same employment conditions as before the crisis. With measure 2, that might have been retained on contract, but for which working time and pay conditions might have been temporarily reduced, while with measure 3, organizations can report staff that's been furloughed. And measure 4 similarly allows the same type of recording, but for supply chain. So if you can click through the animation, Tom, it's really important that with this measure, we keep in mind and we bear in mind that we're not trying to punish organizations that are forced to make these difficult decisions, but rather we take into account that what other conditions and limitations these organizations might be facing. For example, as we've mentioned before, SMEs and VCSEs might have to make these difficult decisions sooner rather than later. And this should be taken into account both when putting some context around these figures, but also while requiring evidence to be provided. And the type of evidence that we suggest are collected are around consideration of realistic alternatives to laying off people. But I think this should be applied with proportionality as well, so that it doesn't become a burden to smaller organizations that simply cannot manage this burden of evidence. So if we can move forward, Tom. The last resource that we have within the plugin is some guidance on the relevance to the COVID crisis response for all the COVID-19 and core national TOMS measures. And this is very much thinking about new tenders or contracts that might be renegotiated, and highlighting what measures can more directly contribute to mobilize resources to tackle the crisis or to minimize the negative impact of the crisis, at least for this first initial phase, which is all about reacting to the crisis. And if you can click through the animation, what you will find within this resource is that some of the measures from the national TOMS have been selected, but not all of them, while all of the COVID-19 measures clearly have been selected. And the way we see this use is very much as a suggested selection. Clearly will not be a perfect fit for each and every contract. So it should be applied with flexibility, but it can be applied as prioritization, or it can be applied, which is something that came up during consultation, as a selection for separate scoring within the evaluation of tenders. So it's all really about the practical application that should always be specific to the circumstances for the contract and the type of parties involved, which is something that we'll hear more about during the rest of the presentation from Terry. So I hope this was useful. Thank you very much. And I pass on to Guy now.
Thanks very much, Agnese. Do you want to click on through the polls now, Tom? We've got another 3 polls. So, okay, first one, how has C-19 impacted your organisation? Do you want to do the poll? All right, that's interesting. So it's interesting. There's a, I mean, presumably the medium reflects some of those organisations that haven't furloughed anyone. Okay, next one, Tom. Have contractual concerns been raised by any of your suppliers? This is mainly aimed at public sector, but any private sector who've got suppliers involved in social value, bring the poll up, Tom. Oh, it's a different one, different question. So let's ask this one. If you are a business, are you seeing COVID-19 requirements being asked in new tenders? Okay, that was the wrong poll, Tom, but let's ask this question anyway. Okay, great. For the next one. How are you managing suppliers who cannot meet social value obligations? Okay, next poll. Great, and the answers? That's interesting. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, that's a good lead in, Terry, to you now. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass on to Terry, who's going to take over from now and then jump to the next slide. Thanks, Terry. Up to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I just want to talk about managing existing tenders and how to address COVID-19 issues in new tenders. So if you can move on one, please, Tom. So these are two areas. So contract management provisions for existing contracts where TOMs have already been applied, and a new set of COVID-19 measures for new tenders. Next slide, please, Tom. So in terms of existing contracts, we recognise that a number of contractors will be struggling in the current crisis and may either not be able to deliver at all on social value commitments, or need to defer them, or actually want to help by amending their social value offer to assist with the issues that they currently see in their communities. So clearly that needs a discussion between the contractor and the customer to resolve how best to address those issues. But in terms of what we've got for the TOMs, as Agnese has set out, we've got the COVID-19 measures, and we have a new column added to the TOMs tool, the COVID-19 on existing contracts. If we could just move on to the next slide, please, Tom. So what we've pulled together here is some suggested wording. We will be making the slide deck available after the webinar, so don't feel we've got to try and hurriedly scribble all this down. But essentially what we're trying to do is set out some wording that you can send to your existing contractors to say, here's some issues that we recognise you've got. We need to have a discussion with you about how best they can be addressed. But if you are able to help in the current crisis, we've got a list of social value measures that are capable of delivery during the current crisis, and helping contractors to identify how they might be able to assist your organisation. So that's for existing contracts. In terms of new tenders, if we could move on one, please, Tom. If you're in the process of developing tender for publication, then you have a couple of options. So you can, of course, only put in the COVID-19 measures, or you can have them as an adjunct to the existing national TOMs that are available, or partly replace them. So you have a range of options about how you can use the COVID-19 measures. What it will do is help with the prioritisation and transparency of COVID-19 measures in procurement. So you need to be clear about how you're addressing those issues. And of course, we do need to be open, fair and transparent about how you're dealing with everything in the process. So we've got options there in terms of new measures that can be included in newly tendered contracts. Hopefully it provides a more transparent way of mobilising resources in the procurement process. And if we go over to the next slide, please, Tom, we'll look at the wording for ITT documents. So worth bearing in mind in thinking about how to use this wording is about what length of contracts are you going out for. If it's a 3 to 6 month contract, then it might be completely COVID-19 orientated only, and you might only want to put in measures that are related to the current crisis solely. But if it's longer term contract, then you might want to have a mixture of COVID-19. So you've got immediate measures that contractors can help you with, some recovery measures, and longer term, hopefully reverting back to normal national TOM, so we can carry on doing what hopefully we wanted to do in the first place, and revert to business as usual. what I think is worth just thinking about in new tenders is emphasising the change mechanism. So generally, I think all public sector organisations will have change mechanisms in their contracts, but I think it's worth just reviewing those and making sure that they're very relevant for social value requirements. So if you need to change social value measures during the course of the contract, either to reflect COVID-19 issues or otherwise, really making sure you've got a robust change mechanism there so that you can utilise that and have discussions with contractors about what they might be able to do to assist you. And then just finally on the evaluation, Tom, if you could move over one, please. So in terms of evaluation, there's some approaches you can take. Obviously, in terms of the social value quantitative score, you might have a scoring that's set aside specifically for COVID-19 responses only on that, or it might be that you set aside a scoring for COVID-19 on the quantitative and the qualitative side of bidders' responses. Another option that you could use, so on the TOMs, we do have a multiplier, so that during the course of procurement, if you want to incentivise a contractor to focus on particular TOMs, then you can set a multiplier of 2 or 3 against the TOMs, which means that it doubles or trebles the value of that TOM. So, for example, if you've got a measure that's worth 10k in social value terms, for procurement only, it could be worth 20k or 30k, and the aim of that is to incentivise bidders to really focus on how they might help you deliver those particular measures. When you then report internally, you revert to the normal social value measure value for that particular item, so that you're not over reporting on the amount of social value you're getting. But if you particularly want bidders to focus on COVID-19, for example, you could put a multiplier on that to assist incentivise bidders on that particular area. And I think that's it for me, Tom, if you'd like to go on one. And I'll hand back to Guy.
Thanks very much for that, Terry. Great. So let's just flick on to the next slide, Tom, which is your panelists. We've just got just under 15 minutes left. And actually, Nathan, I know you've been sitting there patiently listening, and Nathan's our head of strategy at Social Value Portal. And Nathan, earlier today we were having a conversation about the challenge, I think, around SMEs in particular, looking at how they appear to be sort of more adversely impacted than larger businesses, like retail stores, and the big retailers are open but the small aren't. What are your thoughts about the recover phase around SMEs and how we support those?
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you, Guy. So it seems at the moment that one of the things that we're seeing is that larger organisations are better able to cope with social distancing measures, and that's already having an impact, and a differentiating impact between large and small businesses. You've also got sectors where small businesses are predominant, so hospitality, which obviously is suffering very badly from the COVID-19 crisis. But looking forward, the challenge appears to be likely to be even greater for small businesses if the recovery phase involves a partial return to normality, where volume of activity is managed in order to maintain measures that are necessary to kind of minimize the spread of the virus and sustain principles of social distancing. So the challenge facing small businesses as we come out of the recovery phase, in some ways, looks even more even greater than perhaps we kind of anticipate at the moment. And our thoughts are kind of developing on this, but we would like to kind of open a discussion about how we can collectively, proactively kind of support smaller businesses in the supply chain to allow them to get back into to activity without unduly exposing themselves, because they have overheads and they can't generate the sort of volumes of business that allow them to move forward. So it feels like a critical issue for the recovery phase, and we're kind of thinking about how we build that maybe into the next iteration of the COVID-19 TOMs that we're developing.
Yeah, and I think that touches on a question that's been raised by Liam, who asked how long this phase of the TOMs might be sort of relevant. I mean, we're in this react phase at the moment. What are your thoughts, Nathan, on sort of recover and then renew phase? How long do you think this phase will go on when we start going to recover? Or am I asking a question that even Boris Johnson doesn't know the answer to?
Crikey. Yeah, I think we have to be well, I mean, what is clearly the case is that we need to have a number of different scenarios, and we need to look at several different options about how we come out of this phase and the length of time it's going to take, and look at what implications that has for example, our supply chain, for the way in which we can sustain measures at the moment, which are about kind of suspending animation almost in the economy. And kind of have some visibility about what the range of outcomes those different options might cover. Again, Terry touched on this in his session, that sort of question about how you mix COVID-19 and non-COVID-19 measures, and what that balance should look like, and you know, at what point in terms of the length of a contract you go from being just purely reactive to kind of building in recovery. I think the thing that we would all like to avoid is a situation where there's an exclusive focus on the immediate problem right now, however pressing and urgent it is, at the expense of planning for the future and giving ourselves a pathway out of this.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. I've got one I'm going to direct at Terry now. It comes from Lizzie Borolan. It's just jumped up. So, who asks, have you come across any concerns around how to link the COVID measures to the subject matter of the contract in existing contracts? Terry, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, so I can't see that question. So I haven't come across that as yet, but I think it is a question of using change mechanisms to really try and have discussions with contractors and really sit down with them and link the current requirements they have for delivery of social value to what you now want them to deliver. And I think in these particular times, even if you haven't got a good change mechanism, just having sensible discussions with contractors, let them know that you're understanding their situations and trying to set out what you're trying to achieve as well, is very sensible. And the more you can do that, the better that contractors will be able to help you with.
Okay, great. A very practical one. This is for Agnese, and it's from Anna Kukulis from Wilmot Dixon. So it cuts to the core of the volunteering. You mentioned a TOM to engage volunteers to support COVID-19. If staff are furloughed but volunteer their time to support, can a business still claim the value? I know we've been looking at, I don't know whether Agnese or Nathan, you want to answer that, because I know we've been looking at that specifically.
Yeah. I can give it a go, if that's okay. So yeah, we've been looking at this with Nathan, and what we found is that within the legal parameters of what being on furlough means for staff, it is possible for employees that are furloughed to volunteer during their working time, and as long as that happens within working time, that can be counted by business as social value. So I think that's a general principle, and it then becomes a matter of looking at the specific interventions and understanding how the business is facilitating this.
Okay, do you want to add anything, Nathan, at all to that?
No, I think that's fine. We could probably issue, it might make sense for us to kind of issue a little paragraph on that subject after this seminar, actually.
Yeah, I think so. And there's also one that Philip Simmons has just raised. So it kind of falls into the same category to some extent. How can we address the COVID and standard social value measures with contracted suppliers receiving supplier relief or CJRS funding? So that's probably something we need to just look at as well. They're sort of very specific.
Yes.
I've got a general question of anyone who's out there, actually, because we've tried to be, well, the point about what we've done and Agnese has led is just to put a minimum standard of TOMs out there. So some additional measures that we think were relevant. And no, I mean, we started this 3 weeks ago and we rushed it out. But one of the things I think would be really useful is to understand what businesses can actually feel they do, not only during this phase, which is react, but also the recover and renew phase. And I think any input you guys can give us with respect to ideas that we should be including in the TOMs would be gratefully received. One of the questions that's been raised up here by someone, now I've lost it, was about actually funding, actually paying to charities. So if a large contractor would want to donate pounds, this is Ilaria Agueci. If a large contractor would want to donate pounds to a local charity established by the council during this crisis, in which measure would this fall under? Would a pound be a pound, or can it double up with a multiplier? So Agnese, I don't know if I can test you off the top of your head.
Yeah.
Donation one. Do you want to answer that one?
Yeah. So I think that in this example, this would be a donation, a cash donation. And for cash donations, the first thing we should do is clearly record what we call the input value, which is the value of the donation itself. And within the context of the crisis, clearly the priority is to put those pounds to their best and more efficient use. But clearly we shouldn't forget that down the line, we should sort of build on this and really look at what are the outcomes that have those pounds contributed to achieve, and look into what is the value to the beneficiaries and more generally to the stakeholders that have been affected by those interventions, which clearly will be tricky and challenging to measure. But I think with the national TOMs, what we're trying to do is, in the first instance, at least record the input value. But I think this crisis will also shift our perception of value itself, which I think it's a bigger conversation possibly.
Yes, no, I think it is. I think there's a few other questions coming in. So I think this is just a comment from Claire Louise Chapman. I don't know where you're from, Claire, but perhaps you can send this document through and we could distribute it. But Claire says, I produced a short document for SMEs to advise on how to offer appropriate community support, basically using the company's skills, experience and assets to best effect. And I agree. She says that's a good starting point. And I think that it actually is. And I think that one of the things that we would like everyone to do. Have all the slides just stopped? Yeah, Tom, are you in the background changing this? One of the things we'd like you all to do is to contribute however you can. And there's still time, we can still adapt the React toms, but actually the other toms, which are recover and renew, are just as important. And I think we would welcome any contribution on that. And I know that Shariat earlier on in the conversation asked a question around how we developed the toms, and the answer was we went out very quickly to everyone on the task force, and we got some good responses given the time frame. But given that most of the people we went out to were heads of procurement who were in the maelstrom of the crisis, we probably didn't get as many responses as we would normally like. So we focused on a few and got it out, but we are totally open to taking on any other ideas, any other thoughts that people want to share. And I think that, given this is going to go on for some months yet, it would be as well that we begin to collect and then distribute good practice around. So we've come to the end of our session, and we will be sharing this PowerPoint amongst all the attendees, and we've heard some great comments on here. I think this has worked okay. This is the first time we've done it. We'll be doing this in, I think, probably a couple of weeks' time. If anyone's got any ideas about subject matters they would like us to help lead on and put a panel together on, then drop myself a note. And one last point, Agnese, where can the COVID-19 toms be found?
Yes, so the COVID-19 toms can be downloaded from our resources. So if you go on our website, socialvalueportal.com, then you will find the tab resources, where you can find, you can navigate through the different topics, and within the tom section, you can download the latest spreadsheet, which is the version 1.3.
Fantastic. And on that subject matter, just a final, if anyone particularly would like to get involved in developing the measures that we're going to use in recover and then renew, please drop us a line. We would really welcome anyone who's got some thoughts around that, because we've got some brain capacity, but by reaching out, we know we can do a lot more. So look, I'm going to draw it to a close now. First of all, let me thank our panelists, all the panelists, which is Agnese, Terry and Nathan, for your contribution. That's great. I'd also like to thank my team behind the scenes who are working hard to make this happen, particularly Tom Good and also Xander, who've really made this possible. And then, of course, everyone on the call, really appreciate your time. Please stay safe, and we'll look forward to having a conversation in a few weeks' time on another subject matter. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.